On December 28, 1942, President Roosevelt approved an additional $500 million investment in the Manhattan Project. The first priority, to build the massive industrial facilities that would produce the fissionable material to fuel the atom bomb. Robert Oppenheimer's team of physicists doubled the amount of uranium-235 thought necessary to achieve critical mass and sustain an explosive chain reaction to 200 kilograms. Their calculation, made without adequate samples of U-235 for tests, would prove to be 10 times the required amount. The scientists at Los Alamos also studied tampers, barrier materials that would slow the expansion of the critical mass and reflect neutrons back to feed the fission process inside the bomb. Determined to have the atom bomb ready for use in the war, General Groves notified contractors in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, that they had a scant 6 months to build the massive electromagnetic calutrons, designed by Ernest Lawrence at the University of California in Berkeley. These calutrons would be used to separate U-235 from U-238.
Lawrence was, to some extent, an engineer. He was comfortable with the soldering iron and with wrenches and with the tools of the trade, with building machines.
In February 1943, construction began on the Calutron site that was given the deliberately nondescript code name, Y-12. These gigantic structures contained multiple calutrons, box-shaped collection units that were configured in a racetrack layout. A magnetic field passed throughout the entire oval of calutrons, causing the divergence of streams of U-235 and U-238 so that the separated isotopes could be collected. A single calutron could capture a mere 10 grams of U-235 daily. A staggering total of 1,152 would be built by war's end. Because of the intense time constraints, Groves could not afford to build pilot plants, facilities to test the scaling up of the laboratory processes.
They're physically building Oak Ridge and Y-12, the electromagnetic separation plant, before the design drawings had even been approved. And it's incredible that you would never do this in civilian life, and you would never do it short of a wartime emergency that is dire. They turn the Alpha-1 racetrack on to make the first uranium, and everything goes haywire. That the magnets are so strong that they pull nails out of the wall.
Groves arrived and shut the plant down. His response was characteristic of his approach. Since the racetracks were not operating to capacity, more would have to be built to supply the bombs. As a result, the town of Oak Ridge continued to grow to house an expanding workforce. 75,000 people would ultimately come to live at the site. Groves used creative means to recruit them.
It was hard to get construction workers during the war. His solution was to put out ads saying, "We can't tell you what you'll be doing, but there'll be steak every night on the table."
Once hired, workers were instructed to be evasive about what they were doing.
If anybody asks you what you make in Oak Ridge, you tell them you're making the lights for the lightning bugs, or that you're making the holes for the donuts.
Meanwhile, at Los Alamos, design work was underway on the Gadget, as the test bomb came to be known. The main obstacle was how to quickly assemble two smaller subcritical masses into one larger explosive one. The bomb design that they came up with was a gun design. Inside the bomb, a cannon would fire one piece of radioactive fuel into another at 3,000 feet per second. The pieces would have to come together fast enough to prevent spontaneously emitted neutrons from melting the fuel, causing the bomb to fizzle rather than explode.
But the engineering aspects were daunting. It's one thing to say you can shoot a piece of uranium at a second piece, but how do you do it? How fast does it have to go? How do you stop it at the end? How do you keep it together long enough as a mass so that it does go high order and give you an atomic bomb?
Oppenheimer led the effort to overcome these obstacles by setting an example for his team at Los Alamos.
In the middle of the night, something could be done. In would walk Robert just at the right time to see how it went. He was interested in everything, in the explosives, in the mechanics, in the chemistry, in the bomb itself, of course. And this is what makes a big laboratory of thousands of people working together cohere.
Oppenheimer was living on coffee and martinis and cigarettes. Groves was eating Whitman chocolate samplers and sleeping soundly, whereas Oppenheimer was anguished. You know, they were just so different. But they seemed to be able to mesh, and they certainly had a common goal.
And this common goal was about to reach a new level. As scientists refined the design of the gadget, a new man-made element, plutonium, was gaining favor as a possible fuel. Identified in 1941, plutonium was almost twice as likely to undergo fission as uranium-235 and could be produced on a large scale by irradiating uranium in nuclear reactors. In order to produce plutonium, 3 production reactors were designed by engineers at the University of Chicago that would be built in Hanford, Washington. Groves initiated the construction at Hanford on August 27, 1943, with a labor force that had been recruited to the area.
Numbers as high as 60,000 construction workers living in tents out on the Hanford Reservation. So the government went in and bought up 500,000 acres out in the desert of eastern Washington, created this remote construction site, and literally in a matter of months constructed large-scale engineered structures for plutonium production.
But Groves was not content to rely on just 2 approaches, Y-12 and Hanford, to produce the weapons-grade fuel for the bomb. By September 1943, he had begun construction on a 3rd, K-25, a gigantic gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge. In the diffusion process, a gaseous compound, uranium hexafluoride, passes through a cascade of barriers, each one giving a slight enrichment of the lighter isotope U-235. The difficulty lay in finding a barrier that would not be degraded by the very corrosive gas. Scientists and engineers were not able to manufacture a satisfactory barrier until a year after site construction began on K-25. A building that would ultimately cover more area than any structure ever built. The U-shape measured 1/2 mile long by 1,000 feet wide. With an area of 2 million square feet, it contained a series of sealed containers and cascades that ran the length of the building. Oak Ridge continued to grow, and by the end of the war, it was the 5th largest town in Tennessee.
The total power consumption during the K-25 operation during the war in the Manhattan District was about 10% of the electrical energy in the United States.
If you look at the size, the scope of the K-25 site in the Manhattan Project, I don't think there's been any engineering feat to date comparable to what was done within the time frame.
It was looking less and less likely that enough U-235 could be produced to impact the war. At the same time, the alternative, plutonium, was proving to be equally tricky. Impurities in this new element were leading to increased neutron activity that would cause bombs to pre-detonate, to fizzle before the 2 halves joined in a critical mass.
There are production problems at Oak Ridge. They're not sure they can even make any uranium at that point, uranium-235. And so if they can't use plutonium in a gun, there may in fact not even be an atomic bomb.
It's a real crisis. It's at that point that I think Oppenheimer's talent comes to the fore, where he brings in the people, new people in fact, and he reorganizes Los Alamos, but brings people in to solve the problem of how to make a plutonium bomb.
The plutonium bomb's new configuration called for an outer shell of explosives that would direct symmetrical shockwaves inward, compressing a subcritical central mass of plutonium. The resulting increase in the density would shrink distances between nuclei, thus starting the explosive chain reaction.
Nobody had ever taken high explosives, wrapped them around something, and got a symmetrical explosion. And so they weren't even sure they could do that technically. It was a very, very tough engineering problem. So from May 1944 until about August of 44, the laboratory wrestles with this problem.
By late 1944, K-25, the gaseous diffusion plant, was producing enriched U-235 that ran through the magnetic calutrons to effect a further enrichment. This 1-2 punch generated enough fuel for one gun-type bomb. But if, as military strategists thought, it would take more than one bomb to break the enemy's will, then it was crucial that the upcoming test of the new plutonium implosion bomb work. All this uncertainty only served to heighten tensions at Los Alamos as scientists and engineers prepared for the first detonation of an atomic weapon. If the implosion design was successful, it might bring an end to the war.